The story does not begin with a whisper in a bedchamber, but with a chisel on marble. In the year 47 AD, a new statue is raised in the Forum of Augustus. It depicts Valeria Messalina, wife of the Emperor Claudius, mother of his heir, Britannicus. Her likeness is one of austere virtue, the classical stola draped with precise, impersonal folds. The inscription is standard: piety, fertility, loyalty. This is the official record, the one intended for sunlight and public decree. It is a perfect lie. To understand the terror of Messalina's intimate life, one must first understand the architecture that contained it. The institution is the Domus Augusta, the Augustan House. This is not merely a family. It is the central nervous system of imperial power, a sacred entity whose stability is synonymous with the stability of the world. Its walls are not made of brick and mortar, but of bloodline, ritual, and surveillance. The Domus demands absolute transparency from its members, for their bodies are state property. Every breath, every alliance, every birth, and every death is a matter of public legislation and religious omen. The primary victim of Messalina's pursuits, therefore, was not any individual lover, but this very institution. Her method was its systematic subversion from within. The contemporary sources, Tacitus, Suetonius, Juvenal, paint a portrait of a predation that was administrative in its cold efficiency. Messalina did not operate in the shadows of passion, but in the calculated gray zones of protocol. Her documented partners were rarely men of mere personal appeal. They were senators like Gaius Silius, the consul designate, a man whose political stature could threaten the throne. They were knights of immense wealth, whose estates could bolster a private treasury. They were performers and gladiators, whose public popularity could be weaponized. Each connection was a circuit closed, a transfer of influence, a piece of the state apparatus quietly rerouted to a private network. The power of the empress was not executive, but interstitial. She controlled access. She filtered the information that reached the emperor's ears, a man famously susceptible to the counsel of his wives and freedmen. Petitions, judicial appeals, military appointments, all could be accelerated or buried based on the petitioner's compliance with her unspoken requirements. This created a secondary victim class, the Roman elite. Men found themselves navigating a double court, the official one of senatorial debate and the clandestine one of the imperial bedchamber. Refusal was not a simple matter of personal insult. It could be construed as political disloyalty, a capital offense. Consent in this environment becomes a meaningless concept. It is replaced by the calculus of survival. The Domus Augusta had mechanisms for monitoring its women. There were the custodes, the household guards. There were the slave attendants, the ornatrices and cubicularii, whose eyes saw everything. There was the empress's own mother, Domitia Lepida, a rival presence. Yet Messalina neutralized these systems. Loyal guards were rotated to distant posts. Talkative slaves disappeared into the markets, sold downriver. Family members were kept at bay with formal courtesy and implicit threat. She became the sole auditor of her own behavior, a profound and terrifying inversion of the natural order. Her most famous alleged exploit, as recorded by Tacitus, exemplifies this institutional sabotage: the public marriage to Gaius Silius while Claudius was away at Ostia. The event is often sensationalized, but examine its structure, not its spectacle. It was held not in a secret grotto, but in a senator's home with full ceremonial pomp. Witnesses were required and were present. A dowry was negotiated. A contract was signed. This was not an act of lust. It was a dry run for a coup d'etat, a rehearsed transfer of the Domus Augusta's authority to a new head, using the very legal and religious forms that were meant to protect it. The intimacy was geopolitical. Yet, for all this activity, the official record remained silent. The coins bore her serene profile. The edicts praised her pudicitia, her modesty. The public sacrifices she led were conducted with flawless ritual precision. This is the central dissonance, two parallel realities operating within the same physical space, the Palatine Hill. One was of marble and ceremony, daylight and law. The other was of whispered negotiations, strategic assignations, and the quiet, terrifying realization among the powerful that the heart of the state was governed by a private, inscrutable, and ruthless agenda. The emotional arc here is not one of scandal, but of systemic corrosion. A cold dread spreads, not from the gossip of what she does, but from the bureaucratic silence around it. Men of supreme public rank find their fates hinging on their performance in the most private of spheres, a transaction for which there is no ledger, no receipt, only the memory of a shared secret that could, at any moment, become a death sentence. The empress's intimacy becomes a black market for imperial favor, and the currency is the complete surrender of personal and political autonomy. The state sleeps in the bed of its ruler and finds a stranger there. The silence was not an absence. It was an engineered condition, a positive achievement of imperial logistics. To maintain the dichotomy between the public statue and the private network, Messalina required not just will, but a machinery of concealment. This was the second phase, the bureaucratization of transgression. The Domus Augusta, a system built for visibility, was forced to generate its own dark counterpart, a subarchive of unrecorded movements, unexplained absences, and redirected resources. The primary tool was the imperial household schedule, the cursus diurnus. This document, usually managed by the Ab Epistoles, Secretary of Letters, and the Memoria, Keeper of Records, dictated the emperor and empress's every public hour, audiences, sacrifices, meals, rest. Messalina's influence here was subtle. A minor religious observance for the Bona Dea, a goddess whose rites were closed to men, would be expanded in duration and importance, requiring her seclusion. A charitable visit to the domus of a senatorial matron would be scheduled, yet the matron would later be quietly instructed to be indisposed, freeing the location for other purposes. The schedule remained pristine, its codes unbroken, while its reality was hollowed out. Transport was critical. The empress moved in a carpentum, a covered carriage, or a lectica, a sealed litter, each a mobile private chamber. The routes of these vehicles, normally published and cleared by the Germani Corporis Custodes, the Germanic bodyguard, could be altered via sealed orders from the empress's own chamberlain, a freedman whose loyalty was to her personal treasury. A turn down an unlisted street, a pause at a nondescript insula entrance instead of a palace. These deviations were executed with the same discipline as a military maneuver. The litter bearers and outriders were a closed unit, their lives and families dependent on a silence more binding than any oath. Then came the management of personnel, the human infrastructure. The Palatine was a city within a city, teeming with thousands of slaves and freedmen. Messalina's circle relied on a cadre of specialists. The cubicularii chamberlains who controlled access to her apartments were the gatekeepers. The nomenclators, name tellers, whose job was to whisper the identities of approaching petitioners, instead became filters, admitting only those pre-approved. Most crucial were the tabularii couriers, a network of swift, trusted messengers who bypassed the official cursus publicus. They carried no sealed imperial edicts, only verbal messages or small, unmarked tokens, a ring, a fragment of a clay tablet that served as keys and commands. The physical spaces themselves were adapted. Tacitus alludes to a secret and notorious brothel, where the empress would reportedly wait veiled. Whether literally true or a metaphor, the architectural principle is valid. Rooms within the palace complex or properties acquired through proxies in the city were designated for specific functions. These were not lavish love nests, but safe houses, stripped of identifying marks. They were furnished for utility, cleaned by a skeleton staff of mutes or foreigners who spoke no Latin, and accessed through service entrances or interconnected basements. The wealth of the domus was used to create voids within itself, spaces that officially did not exist. The true genius and the true horror of the system lay in its documentation, or rather, its lack thereof. The Roman state was a state of records, birth certificates, marriage contracts, tax rolls, wills. Messalina's parallel institution ran on the deliberate creation of gaps. A knight of the equestrian order appointed to a lucrative provincial post would have his official codicilly letters of appointment, signed by Claudius. But the supporting documentation, the petitions and recommendations that normally filled a file in the tabularia archive, might be scant or suggest a different candidate. The archivist, a freedman named Pallas or another, would know to ask no questions. The paper trail died at the threshold of her door. This created a pervasive, low-grade terror among the administrative class. To be a secretary, an accountant, or a guard in the Domus Augusta was to be trained to see everything. Now, they were forced to practice a sanctioned blindness. You did not see who entered the empress's wing after dark. You did not cross-reference that shipment of fine silks from Kos with the public inventory. You did not wonder why a certain senator's debts to the imperial treasury were suddenly forgiven. The institution's greatest strength, its bureaucratic memory, was being selectively erased, creating a silent, complicit consortium of those who knew enough to know they should not know. The psychological pressure was immense and inverted. Typically, a conspirator fears exposure. Here, the courtiers feared acknowledgement. To have one's name spoken by Messalina in a certain tone, To receive one of her unmarked tokens was to be pulled into the machinery. It was a sentence to a life of perpetual vigilance, where a single slip in maintaining the fiction could bring ruin. Your reward for compliance was not honor, but the continuation of the secret. Your loyalty was not to the emperor nor to the state, but to the integrity of a lie that threatened them both. The institution was no longer a structure of power. It was a vault, and inside it the empress was methodically picking the locks, one silent, bureaucratic procedure at a time. The end came not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a clinical report. In 48 AD, while Claudius presided over a banquet in Ostia, his freedmen's secretaries, Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus, presented him with evidence. The format of this evidence is critical. It was not salacious gossip, but a bureaucratic briefing. They documented the marriage contract to Silius. They itemized the transfer of state assets. They listed the names of compromised officials. They framed the crisis not as one of morality, but of national security. The Domus Augusta had been legally and functionally usurped. Faced with this dry, administrative portrait of treason, Claudius acted with uncharacteristic decisiveness. The purge was swift, secretive, and total. It was conducted not in the forum, but within the guarded confines of the Praetorian camp. Gaius Silius and his associates were executed without public trial. Messalina, granted the mercy of suicide, failed in her attempt and was dispatched by a tribune's blade in the gardens of Lucullus, a place of beauty turned charnel ground. There was no funeral oration. No mourning period was declared. The body was hurriedly given to her mother with instructions for a discreet burial. The official record simply noted her disappearance. The statue in the Forum of Augustus remained, a hollow shell staring over a city that had already been instructed to forget. This was the final institutional phase, systematic erasure. The process is known as damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. It is not an emotional act of hatred, but a cold, procedural one of state hygiene. Her name was to be chiseled from inscriptions. Her portraits were to be recarved into likenesses of the next empress, Agrippina, or simply destroyed. Coins bearing her image were melted down. The goal was to create a historical vacuum to make it as if the subversive network had never existed. The Domus Augusta, wounded, began the process of suturing its own history, but erasure is imperfect. It leaves scars, shadows, and negative space. The very efficiency of the cleanup betrayed its scale. The sudden vacancies in the senatorial roles, the unexplained reappointment of provincial governors, the rapid promotion of new freedmen to replace the purged, these were the bureaucratic ghosts of the affair. The gardens of Lucullus, the site of her death, gained a quiet, unspeakable reputation. Courtiers would walk there and fall silent, not out of respect, but because the location now represented the terminal point of the institution's failure, the place where its internal corruption had to be physically excised. The legacy of Messalina is not a story. It is a protocol. For subsequent emperors, her reign became the foundational case study in internal threat assessment. The regulations governing the access, movement, and financial independence of imperial women were tightened into a suffocating lattice of control. Agrippina the Younger, who followed her, would wield immense power, but she did so through the official channels of regency and political alliance, learning from Messalina's fatal error. She never built a parallel state. She sought to become the state, openly. The covert system was deemed too unstable. For the historical record, she became a useful monster. The accounts of Tacitus and Suetonius, written decades later under a different dynasty, serve a purpose. They cement her as an aberration, a unique toxin. By focusing on her alleged excesses, the brothel, the sexual marathon, they personalize the terror, making it about one individual's moral failure rather than a systemic vulnerability. She is transformed from a master of institutional subversion into a pantomime of lust. This is the final victory of the Domus Augusta. It not only removed the person, but successfully rewrote the crime, exchanging a complex narrative of bureaucratic treason for a simpler, more morally legible tale of personal depravity. The real lesson, that the very apparatus designed to ensure transparency could be weaponized to create absolute opacity, was buried. The echo that remains is the sound of that silence. It is the rustle of papyrus in an archive where a file should be, but is not. It is the hesitation of a historian encountering a gap in the record, a statue with a recarved face, a calendar with a blocked-off day of private observance. The emotional arc concludes not with closure, but with a permanent, low-grade institutional paranoia. The Domus Augusta learned it could not trust its own heart. Every smile, every loyalty, every private chamber now held a potential for negation. The terrifying, intimate life of Messalina proved that the most powerful institution in the world was defenseless against a conspiracy that wore the face of legitimacy and operated in the blind spots of its own meticulous design. The legacy is a chill that never left the marble halls, the understanding that the greatest threats are not those that storm the gates, but those that learn to mimic the house rules, and then, quietly, begin to rewrite them from within.